Hey guys, our devotion today comes from 1 Peter chapter 2. We're looking at verses 1 through 12 today, where Peter is teaching on holiness of believers. Before we look at it, let's remember to be in prayer for our church family, and today we're praying for Danny and Barbara Black. So I think this really flows in from the first chapter. In chapter 1, verse 16, Peter quotes the Old Testament, a passage out of the Old Testament where God says, "Be holy as I am holy." You know, when you think about that really is a crazy requirement for God to place on us, because we know ourselves. Especially, obviously, before we knew Christ, we weren't holy. We couldn't be holy. Even our best was just terrible, insulting to God's holiness. But yet God says, and when he spoke to the Jewish people and gave them the law, he said, "Be holy." That's my requirement for you. I require nothing less. Of course, we understand that's why all of us fall short of the righteousness it would take to save ourselves. And yet, here, Peter is bringing this passage back. Be holy as I am holy. But he's not bringing it back as a requirement for salvation. He is bringing it back as an instruction on how Christians ought to live, how we ought to conduct ourselves. And he really goes into it more in chapter 2. We're called to live holy lives. Not to just, hey, I'm saved now, I'm good, I'm going to heaven, and I'll do whatever I want. But to live lives that bring worship to God and are a witness to people who don't know God. Obviously, one of the images he uses in chapter 2 to picture this is that of the living stone, the cornerstone, of course, and the living stones that are built on top of that, and that's where our church, Living Stones Ministries, gets its name from this passage. But we're familiar with this image of Christ being the cornerstone. And here it calls him the living stone, the stone that was rejected, but we come to that stone, and it gives this image of this spiritual house being built up, and we are the living stones that are coming up into this house of praise to the Lord. And the incredible thing about that image is that without that cornerstone, without that living cornerstone, none of the rest of the house is possible. There is no other living stones. There is no house of worship to God. And I think that's the image we have here of Christ. We run to the cornerstone, the foundation, and because of him, we are able, because of what he did in his sacrifice, and we know that what he did, we are able to be built into a house that is worshipful to God. And I think that's an image of us. Now we know I couldn't have saved myself by my own righteousness, but because of what Christ did for me, I can live in righteousness, and I can live a life that's pleasing to God. I have been set free from sin. I'm no longer a slave to sin, but I am a slave to God now. Let me see here. One of the verses that stood out to me after he talks about the living stones being constructed. "But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, who once were not a people, but are now the people of God, who had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy." If anybody ever asks you what the meaning of life is, it's right there. God created us to bring glory to him, to worship him, to be a testimony of his marvelous grace and his mercy for all of eternity. We can do that when we live a life for him, and we choose righteousness over choosing to live in sin. We're doing that now. He's building us up into that temple of worship to him. I'm going to read on because there's still, it says, Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul. They absolutely do. The things that our body craves, it's not just that God wants to be a party pooper, but they're death, and they bring destruction on our lives and what He wants for us. Having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. Part of the reason that we're called to live holy lives, we can do it because of what Christ did for us. We can live in holiness. It is an act of worship to God. It glorifies Him, and it is a witness to those who don't know God, who see it, and they may accuse you, because that's what the world does. It accuses God, and it accuses the followers of God, just like it accuses Christ, like they accuse Christ of being evil, but they couldn't deny His righteousness. And when the world sees righteousness in us and they see good deeds, it's a conviction of truth on their heart about who we worship and the God that we are built to worship into that temple. So I want to encourage you today to meditate on that and think about the fact that God has called us to live holy lives today, and He has provided the way for us. Let God have His way with you today. Listen, if God spoke something to you out of this passage today, share it with us in a message on Facebook and YouTube. Minister to one another. God